This is The Oddball Show. Welcome to Season 7. The Oddball Show and the Oddball Foundation is dedicated to mental health advocacy through art.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I'm super excited to interview you, so.
All right, here I am in the flesh. All right.
Yeah. All right, I'm just like so excited to interview you. This book was phenomenal.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah. So, all right. So we're live on the Oddball Foundation Facebook page, and basically Oddball Foundation is a 501c3 mental health advocacy, creative advocacy. Have the Oddball podcast, Oddball magazine, the Oddball show.
So does the fact that I'm on it mean that you've identified me as an oddball?
Maybe. I thought your book was so incredible that I wanted to talk. Honestly, I was doing a neurofeedback. Do you know what neurofeedback is? Have you ever?
Only the barest.
Well, it's a computer modality where you're plugged in via your two sensors to your computer. Yeah. And I was reading your book and I loved it, and I actually saw that you had done a bunch of interviews, and I was like, well, maybe I'll throw my hat in the ring, and you actually agreed to come on the show, so phenomenal.
Happy to be here. So
yeah, so I'll kind of do a little intro, and then we'll get into this. So today on the Oddball Show, my name is Jason Wright, and I will be your host. I'm so excited to be interviewing our guest today on the program. Today, ladies and gents, I am interviewing Andy Norman, the director of the Humanism Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University and the founder of the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. His work appears in Psychology Today and The Humanist, and he appears on the Joe Rogan Experience as well as the BBC's Naked Scientist. His newest book, Mental Immunity, discusses what Norman calls cognitive immunology. He is developing a mind vaccine that is capable of mitigating confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and conspiracy thinking. A big welcome to Andy Norman.
Thanks very much, Jason.
Happy to have the chance to interview. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure. I appreciate you having me on the show.
So, I mean, the book is absolutely fantastic, and I have a lot of questions and want to get your idea of what this mind vaccine is. So let's get right into it. So, you define ideology in the book as a set of bad ideas. This can mean so many things. So what are some examples of bad ideology?
Well, let's start with one that I hope we can all agree on. Seems to me that white supremacism or white supremacy, the ideology of white supremacists is quite clearly a dysfunctional and destructive set of ideas. Now, there may be people listening for whom that is not obvious. If that doesn't work as an example for you, we could choose maybe Marxism or something like that, which I also believe is an ideology. So, I mean, the fact is, sets of ideas can serve their human hosts well, or they can serve their human hosts poorly. And sometimes sets of ideas infiltrate minds, infect minds, and spread from mind to mind, even though they're not helping us. And we need a name for the ideas that aren't serving us well, and the nexi of beliefs that aren't serving us well.
Nexis, yeah.
Nexis. So I propose that we use the word ideology to designate such things, and I think we all need to be more open to the possibility that ideologies have infiltrated our own thinking, so that we're more open to changing our minds about things.
Well, you really just defined it in the book as bad ideas, a set of bad ideas. And I thought that was a really good way of looking at a lot of things, a lot of different concepts as just bad ideas, just, being parasitic and contagions. And so I thought that concept was just like, when you said, a set of bad ideas, well, that could be anything. So, especially like, when we're talking about today's current climate and anti-vaxxers and all that kind of stuff, and what could be considered a bad idea or a destructive idea or harmful idea, or you mentioned in the book flat Earth theory and some of those kind of things, as well as of course these obvious Marxism, white supremacism, nationalism, apologetics, which I thought was a beautiful. I love that little concept you came up with. You have this idea of cognitive toolbox, right? The cognitive toolbox is how would you define the cognitive toolbox to people if they didn't know what that was?
Yeah, so for a long time, we've been trying to beat back the flood of bad ideas with the concept of critical thinking. We teach people how to evaluate arguments. So if you go to college, you'll very likely encounter a teacher that's really big on critical thinking. And what they do is they basically say, here's how arguments can look convincing, but actually be flawed. And they show you 50 different ways that arguments can mislead. That's fine and good as far as it goes. But it turns out that critical thinking instruction, the way we've been doing it for a long, long time, just isn't enough to basically inoculate our minds against the really seductive ideas that are spreading across the internet. So we need to take our critical thinking game to the next level. And the way to do that is to take the science of mental immunity seriously. So it turns out that there's this little known science that of how the mind fights off bad ideas. It turns out the mind's system for doing that is very similar to the body's immune system. It behaves the way the body's immune system does. So if we can learn from what the scientists are telling us about resistance to bad ideas, we can take those findings and learn to become better thinkers, each and every one of us.
Yeah, when you're talking about, I imagine you're talking about the Socratic method versus the Platonic method, what you're talking about, right? And I do this, I had a bunch of questions and I'm jumping right into the mind vaccine, but
it's all good. I did just to help your audience, that I'm a philosopher by training, and most of you will have heard of the Socratic method. It's a technique pioneered by an ancient Greek philosopher named Socrates. And basically he used clarifying questions to really get clear about what the idea is. And he was really good at using questions to spot the defects of bad ideas. And so philosophers have been in love with this technique for a long time. And I actually think that we need to bring it back, modify it for the internet age, and put it to work against all these mind infections going around.
It was a combination of different the Socratic versus the Plato, and how they all when you talked about later on in the book about there's four schools of thought: the empiricism and Socrates and Plato and then Hume and all those parts of the book. But I want to bring us back a little bit just to Chapter 2, right? No, Chapter 3, Widening Gyre. You talk about the book. I'm an author, a poet, a writer. You talk about The Falcon by W.B. Yeats. Yeah. And you talk about that, what is its significance to mental immunology?
Yeah, so the I think he's an Irish poet named W.B. Yeats, wrote a poem. It's spelled Yeats, but pronounced Yeats. So they tell me in English department. My English colleagues tell me.
You're probably right. Yeah, you're probably right. But it's not like there's like a phonetic.
Something else I can help with.
No. Thank you for spying on me, though. I appreciate it. That's awesome.
Big brother watching you there.
I know, right? No, but it's not like it's phonetically spelled Yeats. I always thought it was. Is it Yeats?
It's spelled Yeats, and that's the way I pronounced it in my mind until somebody set me straight.
It's the two Utes.
Something like that, right? Yeah. But it's a beautiful poem.
It is,
and not just a beautiful, but also powerfully evocative of how disorienting the world can feel when mental immune systems break down. When people's ability to distinguish truth from falsehood starts to get clouded and confused. And with misinformation spreading freely across the internet, I think a lot of us are having trouble figuring out what's true and what isn't. And Yeats's poem sort of evokes. So Yeats lived through the build-up to World War I, and he watched as crazy ideologies started spreading across Europe and turning people into hyper-partisan nut jobs. And it resulted in what they called the Great War, the war to end all wars. And right now we're watching misinformation addle people's minds all over the world today, and it could end very badly if we don't get our
Right.
stuff straight.
Stuff straight, right? All right. So you're making a lot of good points. I think that it's about. I like the idea in the book you talk about persuasion and not to be persuasive, like overly persuasive or under persuasive where you're a nihilist, you don't believe in anything, or persuasive where you're kind of gullible and you kind of believe everything. But like, what is the difference? Like, what is it like to be in the middle of like persuasive mind?
Yeah. So the first. When I try to think about persuasion, the first thing I like to remind myself of is that all persuasion is almost always better than coercion. It's better to have somebody talk you out of what you want to do than to have somebody force you to behave differently. So insofar as we can collectively opt for persuasive modes of modifying one another's behavior, that's a good way to respect each other's autonomy and freedom to choose. So I'm a big fan of persuasion as a behavior modification tool. But of course, there are forms of persuasion that are underhanded or manipulative, right? There's manipulative advertising, there's propaganda. And these are persuasive too, but in kind of an insidious way. Conspiracy theories are really seductive. They're persuasive. They hijack minds, but again, not in a good way. So we need to train our minds to be persuaded by things that are genuinely reliable, and train our minds not to be persuaded by things that are unreliable but sexy.
Yeah. I kind of love the idea where you said in the book, you said someone who is able to be persuasive and reasonable. No, let's see if I got this right. Basically, you said they can be an ideologue. Like they can be an ideologue, and that's like like risky not risky, but like someone who can be overly persuasive and understanding, and also reasoning, and like knowing it all can also be an ideologue at the same time. And that was kind of interesting.
I think I'm remembering the passage you're referring to. I'm particularly concerned to help people understand how important it is to be willing to be persuadable. So if you're willing to be persuaded by new information, that's open-mindedness. But the moment you say, these are my beliefs and I'm sticking to them no matter what, you start becoming closed-minded, you become unpersuadable, and then you become a problem. So I think it's really, really important to remain persuadable, always be in principle persuadable, but that doesn't mean you just bend with every new bit of information that comes along. You vet the new information and test it for reliability, and only rely on it if it proves to be objectively reliable.
Yeah, but it's incredibly difficult to do this. Like a lot of people are duped. They listen to media or they listen to information, and all of a sudden they're on this they're following some ideologue. They're literally following someone's ideology, and it's it becomes destructive and parasitic, and that's kind of the idea of how the need for this mind vaccine. So you talk about subtractive learning. Like what is subtractive learning? Like, how do we go about subtractive learning?
Yeah, so we have, I think most of us carry around within our heads a mental model of what learning looks like. And it involves taking in information integrating it with the stuff that's already in your mind, and then proceeding, going on with your business. Or it's like taking on new knowledge is, I think, a standard way to think about learning. But it turns out that because bad ideas infiltrate our minds all the time, the only way to become wise is to also subtract out the bad stuff. You have to add more good stuff, add more knowledge, but also subtract out the pretense, subtract out the misinformation, subtract out the ideology, because these are things that can bend your thinking in harmful ways. And we have to learn how to spot the bad ideas that we've already taken on and learn how to shed them. I mean, in the same way that our bodies have to learn how to spot COVID, right? What the COVID vaccine does is it trains the body's immune system. It teaches it how to spot a harmful parasite and neutralize it. And we need to do the same thing with our bodies. The same thing we do with our bodies, we need to do with our minds. We need to train them to spot the ideas that are either false or harmful or otherwise dysfunctional.
So let's talk about that. How do you spot bad ideas? How do you listen to good ideas? How are you not duped or persuaded, but you have a healthy balance of critical thinking? I mean, honestly, sometimes people really don't critically think, right?
That's true. And then sometimes people become overcritical. That's the balance that you're alluding to there. I like to illustrate this point with a joke. So Fred the flat earther dies and goes to heaven. And when he gets there, God, he gets a chance to chat with God. And he says, God, I've been a flat earther my whole life. But I have to know, is the world flat or is it round? And God said, I'm sorry to say, Fred, but the world is very, very round. And Fred goes, this conspiracy goes higher than I thought. Right?
I love that.
So it's not that Fred the flat earther is uncritical. It's that he's hypercritical. So when we've been teaching critical thinking, we've been teaching people how to be more critical, how to ask more questions, how to be less trusting. But it turns out you can become so distrustful that your mind starts backfiring in other ways. So it's not as though being more suspicious is always better. You can be too suspicious for your own good, and you can be too suspicious for the good of our society as a whole. And Fred exhibits that level of suspicion. You can be so suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry that you deprive yourself of medicines that would really help you.
Yeah. You talk about in the book, first of all, I love that anecdote, and I think it really illustrates exactly how someone is just so fixed in their own ideas that it goes higher than they think, right? That's the other. There's another one that's similar to that, where the guys ask. It's more of a willing belief thing. We'll get into that, where he's talking about like, hey, I was asking, for you to save me, God, and like 3 boats came to help him out. That kind of. He's like, well, I sent a boat and I sent a life raft and whatever. So it's kind of. Yeah. That's kind of like another idea that you talk about in the book as well. But I think you even mentioned. Did you mention that in that book? In the book, I think.
Yeah, that's that joke too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the version I heard it, a deeply religious guy, his ship capsizes and he ends up in a lifeboat, but he's so infused with optimism that God will save him that he turns down offer after a rescue, says, don't worry about me, God will rescue me. And when he finally dies and goes to heaven, he's like, God, why didn't you save me? And God says, who do you think sent all those ships?
What I like about your book is there's a lot of humor. There's a lot of humor in it. There's a lot of new ideas, just new ideas, fresh ideas. I got this book unassuming that it would be good. I mean, to be honest with you, I got it at the library. I got it. I said mental immunity. This might be helpful. I mean, I live with a mental health issue. I've lived with it for 25 years or so, I've found that reasoning, lowering meds, holistic therapy, meditation, all those kind of things are good for it. I thought that, mental immunity, what an idea. I know people have ideologies that are destructive, and one thing you talked about one thing that you mentioned in the book was the idea of mental illness. You talk about mental illness for a minute, and I think it was a really amazing concept. It made me think, like I once read this book. I love reading different theories about where mental health comes from, right? Mental illness comes from. And I read a book by Dr. Manjir Samantha Loughton. She was on my show, and she talked about quantum physics and how mental health can be just an imbalance, just like a major shift in balance, right? And when when your equilibrium's off, it can cause psychosis and all sorts of stuff. And it was a beautiful concept. In this one, you talk about like reading into things too much, just not maybe obsessing over things a little bit can be kind of causing a little bit of disruptive, and it also can be kind of a parasitic thinking, right?
Yeah. I've been influenced by some philosophers and some scientists who increasingly are drawn to the idea that the ideas we take on reshape our minds. So it's not as though we're either, that we have mental health or mental issues on the one hand, and then we have the contents of our mind over here. The contents of your mind actually affects the way your mind behaves, the way your mind performs. And so I think we need to break down the barriers between, mental therapeutics and critical thinking. I think critical thinking is actually a really important tool for helping our minds stay well functioning. We have to clear away the ideas that confuse us, clear away the ideas that are false or destructive, so that we can think clearly and well and be the best versions of ourselves. So I think there aren't many people yet in the psychology field who recognize cognitive immunology as a branch of mental health or a science of mental health. But I think it's moving rapidly in that direction, and it won't be long before people say, we actually need to help people weed their mental gardens.
Yeah,
if we want to help them be healthy.
Tony Robbins says in a thing I read, he says, if you have weeds in your garden, they're going to overtake your garden. They're not, so in this way, if your brain is filled with bad ideas, it's going to overtake your brain with bad ideas, Now, what if someone says, like, in the book, you talk about like immune disruptive factors, right? Mm-hmm. So one of them was, I'm entitled to my own belief. My beliefs are private. This is my opinion. This is how I feel. This is my opinion. And how can you talk to someone who says like, hey, these are my beliefs. My beliefs are private. My
business, not yours, right?
My business, not yours. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of we as a culture have a lot of work to do to overcome a sense of cognitive entitlement, a sense that everybody is entitled to believe what they and think the way they want. The fact is, the way we think affects the well-being of others. Once you see that your own thinking habits can harm others, you have to question the idea that we're entitled to think in any way you like. So if I indulge in there's a famous example from the history of philosophy where a ship owner indulges in the belief that his ship is seaworthy, even when it's basically become unseaworthy. And then he sends this passenger ship out to sea with a lot of passengers aboard, and it sinks. And the question I ask my students is, well, is this guy morally at fault for indulging in these comforting beliefs that his ship is just fine? Thank you very much. And the students invariably say, no, you can't just indulge in self-serving beliefs about ships and fancy yourself a good person. And in just the same way, I don't think we can indulge in self-serving beliefs about vaccines, or self-serving beliefs about global warming, or self-serving beliefs about, if the idea that I'm in on the big flat earth conspiracy makes me feel important, and I let this idea makes me feel important feeling addle my perception of the facts, I'm indulging in beliefs that harm others. And I don't think we have a right to do that.
So, can I ask a question?
Please.
How do we know what's real and what's not real?
Yeah, boy, that's a big one. That's one of the granddaddy philosophical questions of all time. I'm writing a book about this too, a kid's book actually, called The Truth Fairy. So It features a little girl whose tooth is coming loose, and one of her friends tells her that the tooth fairy will come and replace it with a $5 bill, and another friend said, nah, the truth fairy isn't real, it's just pretend. And she's trying to sort out, how do I know what's real, Grandpa? And she goes to her grandfather, and her grandfather actually uses sort of deep philosophical wisdom to help the little girl, her name is Sophie, answer that question. So there's no simple answer to the question, but what philosophers have discovered over thousands of years is that if a belief about something being real doesn't withstand scrutiny, and it should be able to withstand a really tough set of questions, if it can't do that, it's probably not true, and the thing it talks about may not be real. So the big test for the most important habit of mind we can develop is to examine our ideas carefully, test them with as many questions as we can come up with. And often that means having conversations with other people who see things differently, and then toss out the ideas that really don't withstand that kind of examination. And that basic rule of thumb will help people sort out the difference between reality and fantasy.
First off, I love that you're writing a new book. That's awesome. Is just writing one of your major passions? Is that just something that has always fueled you as a person? Just writing?
I wish now that I'd taken writing more seriously when I was a young man. I was more kind of a science nerd who wasn't very good at writing, so I've actually had to spend decades of my adult life learning how to write well. But yeah, it remains a difficult process for me.
Oh, for sure.
But this one book that you've discovered is the labor of about 30 years, and I've poured my heart and my soul into it for so long, and these are the ideas I want to be remembered for 1,000 years from now, and I think they have the power to change our civilization for the better. So when people like you say, I read your book and there's so much here that's fresh and interesting, that really means a lot to me, because thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is fresh and interesting, and there's just a great way of describing everything. Can we talk about? Is the vaccine that you speak of, is that something that you want people to read about, or can we dive into it a little bit, like this?
Sure.
This idea of the new Socratic model. Can we talk about that? Because I love it. I think it's a beautiful concept.
Well, thank you very much. So the humanity only discovered how to vaccinate our bodies against smallpox and diphtheria and polio just the whole concept of a vaccine was only invented like 200 years ago. And since then, the technologies that idea have made possible have saved literally millions, hundreds of millions of lives. I mean, this is an incredibly powerful tool for saving human lives and reducing human misery. Well, it turns out that we're on the verge of a new scientific revolution where we can revolutionize, where we can help our minds become substantially more immune to morally disorienting ideologies. And if we can do that, I think we can build a future that's substantially healthier and more prosperous and more peaceful than we would have otherwise. So I actually try to imagine what a mind vaccine would look like, what a general purpose mind vaccine would look like. And I ended up concluding that it would look a lot like the Socratic method, that the very same technology of idea testing that Socrates pioneered 2,400 years ago, that very same technology is a very powerful mind inoculant. It's a really good way to strengthen your resistance to bad ideas, which is a way to become wiser. We can take that basic method and we can refine it in ways that are similar to the way immunologists refine naturally occurring inoculants. Hope that may not have made sense. That the inventor of the vaccine took a naturally occurring inoculant and he refined it to create something that was even more powerful than it was originally.
Yeah, that's what you said. You said that's how the guy came up with smallpox. He came up with smallpox because cowpox? Was it called cowpox?
Yeah, he came up with a vaccine for the smallpox. For smallpox, it turned out that cowpox inoculates you against smallpox also. And he refined it into something that could be administered on a wide scale and probably has saved more human beings than just about anybody in history. I think we can do something similar with our minds to keep our minds from being overrun by wacky conspiracy theories and all.
In the book, you mentioned that, yeah, he did, but he didn't patent the idea, which was, a beautiful humanistic concept, but like, people are like, why didn't you think to like put your name on that, man? Like, you would have made a lot of money. But he said, this is not for me. This is for humanity. And that's hey, gold star.
You're talking about one of my hometown heroes, Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine.
Oh, Jonas Salk. Yes. Polio. Yes.
Yeah. So polio was a terrifying disease, and Salk studied it for years in a lab, right? Actually, just a mile or two from where I'm sitting right now, and came up with a vaccine that made him a hero worldwide. And he was once asked, did you ever think about patenting your vaccine, your formula? And he said, you can't patent that. That would be like patenting the sun, he said.
Yeah. I wish Pfizer had that mentality.
I'm with you, brother.
This is for humanity.
Hey, two things are true, Jason. It's possible to be too suspicious of the big pharma, and what you're saying is 100% true. The profit motive can distort health outcomes in all kinds of ways, and does all the time.
Well, you talk about Sinclair at one point. You talk about Upton Sinclair, and you say two things that were really good. And one was that you said it's hard for someone to be a good person when they're doing their, what was it? When they're,
yeah.
Upton Sinclair, he's talking about it's basically the concept of it's hard to be a good person when you're getting paid a lot of money to not be a good person. I think it's something like that.
That's right. Let's see if I can put a finer point on it. He said it's hard for a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
That's what it was. Yeah, that's a pretty funny line there. So can you kind of explain that a little bit, maybe kind of go in? Actually, let's just change course, because that wasn't really something I was going to talk about. I actually wanted to talk about. I of course we can talk about it. It's fine. I just it popped in my head. But my next question is, I thought it was very interesting. You talk about William James and you talk about Clifford. You talk about willing belief versus reasonable belief, or willing beliefs versus
evidence-based belief.
Evidence-based beliefs. But then you talk about, let's talk about that for a little bit. But then I want you to talk about how this guy was talking about pragmatism, but then he was like, I want to call this pragmatism. And I just thought I got a kick out of that. Like, he was like, no, pragmatism, that's too mainstream. I'm going to call it pragmatism. Enough with you guys. And then he moves on. So can you tell me a little bit about that story?
Sure. This is I actually tell the story about an infamous philosophical kidnapping. So a guy named Charles Sanders Peirce invented a philosophy called pragmatism, where he basically said we need to pay attention to the usefulness of our ideas, not just the truth of our ideas. And one of his followers, William James, loved his idea so much that he adopted the pragmatist label, but then started changing the philosophy. And Peirce got his nose out of joint, because James had taken his philosophy in directions that Peirce didn't approve of. So he said his child, pragmatism, had been kidnapped. And then he grumpily renounced pragmatism and declared himself a pragmaticist instead, which was his kind of curmudgeonly way of saying, you guys don't understand me.
It's such a cool way of saying, like, hey man, like, you don't get it. You don't get pragmatism. I'm making my own thing up. It's pragmatism.
And of course, the word pragmatism is so ugly that not a single other person has adopted that label.
I know, but like pragmatism is like I'm a pragmatism, but pragmatism, no. But it's a rebel thing. He was a rebel philosopher, or that's a rebellious thing to say. No, pragmatism's cool. Pragmatism, no, I'm going to take that and run with that.
Right.
All right. So okay, go on. So you had this great quote in chapter 9 from Jacques Rousseau. The mind is born free, but everywhere it is in chains. What does that mean exactly in today's So the philosopher you're referring to is one of the great political philosophers of all time, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He starts off his classic work of Enlightenment political philosophy with the line, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." And I took that quote and I changed it into "the mind is born free, but everywhere it is in chains." Because I think we're born without any ideologies, but many of us die with our minds firmly fixed in some form of ideological concrete. And I want to understand why our minds become fixated on, in some cases, bad ideas, and figure out ways to loosen up our minds so that we don't become trapped in that kind of concrete. When you talk about that idea, don't you think a lot of this stuff is ingrained, like where we are taught it? We're either taught it from our parents, we're taught it from our environment, our community. Well, I really feel like ideologies are ingrained in us from the get-go. So you're right. No mind is born with ideologies. They are taught, they are learned.
And there's probably nobody whose mind doesn't have some ideological elements seep in. I mean, none of our minds is pure. We all need to be able to examine and toss out bad ideas. But there are systems of beliefs that are comforting and that tell us you're on the side of the angels. So if I grow up in a conservative family and I'm taught that conservatives are the good guys and the liberals are the bad guys, then by calling myself a conservative, I get to feel good about myself, right? And when you start believing things because it feels good to believe it, your thinking can grow unhinged. And this isn't just true of conservatives. You can become wedded to liberal ideas and also lose your way. So the trick, I think, is not to let your beliefs define you. Whenever you identify with a set of beliefs or a set of doctrines or a set of creeds, then any attempt to raise questions about those ideas or beliefs or creeds feels threatening. And then you tend to overreact. In fact, the mind will, at a subconscious level, your mind will overreact to information it finds threatening. And if you don't learn to calm your mind so that it doesn't overreact, you can fall down a rabbit hole and become an ideologue without even realizing it's happening.
Yeah. I love the chapter Reason Unhinged. I believe that's one of my favorite chapters of the book. What I like about it was how you systematically broke down organized religion and how it became. Was it in Reason Unhinged? Was it the one where things can? I just thought it was just a really good concept. So if you could talk about that concept of the Reason Unhinged.
Happy to.
That chapter. That chapter is a beautiful chapter.
Thank you. I really worked hard on that chapter, and it's probably one of my favorites too. Look, I think the point is this. So reasons are like levers. We use them to pry some ideas out and to lever other beliefs into each other's heads. And levers only work if they have a fulcrum. So if a fulcrum is the point around which a lever pivots. And the point around which reasons pivot is the idea that better reasons should change your mind. If you don't accept that a good reason should change the way you think, then reasons have no power over you. But that's a bad thing. It's a good thing to give genuinely reliable information the power to change your mind, to relinquish that power, to make yourself persuadable in the face of better arguments and reasons and evidence is a wonderful virtue. And when your attachment to certain beliefs causes you to ignore or violate that norm, the norm becomes weaker, the fulcrum starts to degrade, and your ability to distinguish fact from fiction starts to fall apart. So you need to make a mental habit of paying really close attention to what's objectively reliable, not that you assume is reliable or not that you think is reliable, but what really has the goods in terms of being objectively reliable, and letting those objectively reliable things change your mind. And the problem is right now that there's so many apparently reliable sources out there on the internet that genuinely aren't. When we put our trust in them, we're letting the people who maintain those websites manipulate us. And there's a lot of people out there who are profiting by selling unreliable information, inflaming people's resentments and anger and fear, and they're playing us. We need to learn how not to be taken in by these people, because they're genuinely hijacking people's minds. And so there's a set of tools that comes out of this research that I do that can protect our minds from these unscrupulous manipulators of the way, the people who are working very hard to manipulate the way we think.
All right, so I want to kind of talk about the idea that you came up with. You were talking about how school is like a church. You said you didn't say it. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Never read it. Always wanted to read it. I never read it. It sounds like you're very well read. That's another question we can ask. But you talk about this idea of this not a rigid belief structure, but like a almost like a theology that asks questions, that is celebrated for asking questions. And I thought that was a pretty cool concept. So I thought maybe you might want to talk about that.
Thank you. Sure. I appreciate the invitation. I try to imagine a religion that embraces the beauty of belief change. So instead of a religion doesn't in principle have to be wedded to, religions don't in principle have to be closed-minded. Historically, they have, religions have come together around shared beliefs and then defended those ideas, often in the face of contrary evidence. But this new science I'm helping to get off the ground shows how that can unhinge your mind. And so I try to imagine what it would be like for a religion to actually celebrate belief change and to facilitate learning. A university about 2 miles from me, University of Pittsburgh, has a 35-story building called the Cathedral of Learning. I love the concept, and it's a beautiful edifice. And it's built in some kind of like some of the sort of Gothic cathedral-esque style. But it's actually a cathedral not to belief stasis, but a cathedral to the change learning is belief change. And this is an edifice dedicated to belief change. And I think that's a beautiful idea. So I try to imagine the world's religions actually getting with the program there and becoming agents of the evolution of more and more and more enlightened thinking.
It was a really cool concept, and it kind of made me smile. And then you brought in the idea of John Lennon, imagine a world without religion. Can you try? No one to kill or die for. What a beautiful concept, And first of all, I got to ask: are you a Beatles fan? Do you like the Beatles?
I love the Beatles. I'm nowhere near the Beatles fan that my niece Maya is. She's the real Beatle fan in the family, but there are dozens of Beatles songs that I love.
Yeah, and Paul McCartney, he when he left the Beatles, he formed Wings, and John Lennon formed the John Lennon Band, and he talks about this really radical idea of Imagine, and it's one of the most beautiful songs, and it still makes me smile. It's a great concept because he really believed in the idea of world peace, that like it was possible, and it's kind of sad that like another person who was loved him actually killed him. But that's really pretty a scary concept for John Lennon and for anyone really.
Yeah, I think the lyric, that song is such a beautiful contribution to our culture, and Absolutely. It's a beautiful song. So how does like the idea that you're coming up with, how does that have to do with John Lennon's Imagine? Like if you broke down the lyrics of Imagine, it's a very peaceful world of people with critical thinking. Yeah. So the key, the line from that song that haunts me is imagine no religion. And so in that song, John Lennon invites us to imagine a world without religion and ask ourselves, would that be a better world or a worse world? And I think the answer depends on how you define the word religion. So some people assume one concept of religion, subtract that from the world, and the resulting world, the world they imagine, is a far worse world. And other people have a different definition of religion, and when they subtract that, they see a better world. So we really need to clarify our concept of religion to do that thought experiment properly. And I think I basically say, if this is what you mean by religion, it would probably be a bad thing to get rid of it. But if this is what you mean by religion, it might be a very good thing to get rid of it. Well, you take the good parts of religion, like the community and the congregation and the thinking and the
being with people in the community, and you're just taking out the bad ideas that are kind of outdated, and it's a beautiful idea. I love that chapter.
Thank you. You understand me well. I it's gratifying that you read that deeply and understood
well,
it.
I mean, you really broke it down, like and I gotta say the reasons fulcrum idea is it's kind of it's kind of, I'll be kind of honest with you, fulcrum, I didn't know what that word meant. I wasn't sure what a fulcrum was, but when you describe it as a lever and being able to kind of balance things, is that kind of what we mean? We're about like balancing things?
Yeah, think of the thing in the middle of a teeter-totter. That's the fulcrum around which the seesaw.
So you're not on one way, you're not on the other way, you're balanced on things. And, one thing I think about ideologies is someone is fixed in their own beliefs, whether it's like Republican, or Democrat, or conservative, or liberal, or whatever, whatever it is, I'm a Red Sox fan. A lot of people hate the Yankees who are Red Sox fans, and they just say, I hate the Yankees. I mean, that was, and I don't care if you're a New York Yankees fan, I don't like you. And that is a really bad idea. I mean, you're a joke, but it's kind of like these hateful ideologies are, and they are just really, they're really precipitated by the media. The media will literally vilify people, will harp on one idea till it's like, and
this is excuse me for interrupting, but I really like your thought process here. I mean, one of the things psychologists have discovered is that our minds are hardwired for tribalism. We're a deeply tribal. Our thinking slips into deeply tribal forms very easily, whether it's Red Sox fan, Yankees fan. I'm a Steeler fan myself, and some of my tribal passions come out on Sunday.
That was a game. That was a game the other day. Yeah.
How about that, huh?
Yeah,
crazy.
Field goal. Wow.
It's the ugliest football I've ever seen my home team play, and we don't deserve to be in the playoffs, but we are.
Yeah.
But
on a side note, I was in fantasy football all year long, and I got 5th place, even though I beat the person that I was in, and I'm gonna have to be on the sidelines to watch. That's what fantasy football is anyway. But so sorry, I didn't mean to derail you. You were talking about the Steelers or just like these ideologies, and
we all need to be aware of the fact that there are people out there who are trying to manipulate our tribal instincts, and they will use propaganda and political rhetoric to inflame our partisan passions and make us more tribal than we have any right to be. So we need to figure out a way to become less tribal, less partisan, and understanding that we all have an inclination that way, and that you actually have to make a deliberate effort to counteract your own tribalism if you want to be a decent person. So we got a lot of work to do collectively to de-tribalize our culture, to make our culture less partisan, because otherwise our nation's going to fail, and we're going to have a really hard time in the coming decades.
Well, I got to say, I'm thrilled that you came on the show. I'm so thrilled. I love the book. I thought it was well written. It has such great ideas. Listeners of the Oddball Show, you absolutely have to check out Mental Immunity, written by Andy Norman. Beautiful book. I think it was an incredible read. It took me a while because I actually did this thing. That I've been doing because I read 34 books last year, right? It was fine. I know people read 50. It's not that big of a deal. But I started taking notes on books, and I took after every chapter. I took notes on every chapter, and now I'm reading Bill Bryson's History of Everything.
Beautiful book. I love that book.
It's very good, but it's also like chapter 4. This one talks about geology and all the people that were in it. Chapter 5, this one's talking about dinosaurs. Chapter 6, and I'm kind of slowing it down because I really got into your book, and I was writing down all the concepts of it, and because let's be honest, nonfiction books, right? I want to write a nonfiction book. I've written a lot of poetry books. Poetry is easy. It is. I mean, Andy, it's easy. Poetry is easy, but writing nonfiction is difficult. It is a difficult concept. And first of all, I got to ask, how long did the research for this book take? Because, you talk about Yeats, there's a bunch of Yeats.
There you go. Good.
Yeats. You talk about Plato. You talk about all the philosophers. You talk about William James. You talk about all these different things.
Yeah, thanks for recognizing that. I really did work hard on this.
Yeah.
I really started thinking about these issues really over 30 years ago, and this is an extension of work I was doing as a graduate student back in the early 90s. So it's hard to know. I mean, I took some time off from this project in the middle, but the writing itself took 5 years of hard work, not because the ideas changed so much, is because I had to work really hard to express them beautifully and clearly and simply, or at least as beautifully and simply and clearly as I could manage. So I wanted to communicate deep and powerful ideas in an accessible and fun way. And I'm sure I didn't manage it for every reader, but it's always gratifying to come across.
You have a game at the end of the book. At the end of the book that people can play to literally strengthen their mental immunity. So you really put a lot of work into it. I gotta say, all right, so oddballmagazine.com is poets, authors, writers. We're writers, right? A lot of us are poets. A lot of us are fiction writers. A lot of us are amateurs. A lot of us are pros. A lot of us are just writers, right? And a writer, right? You go to school to be a carpenter or a plumber or whatever, and you go into a trade, right? You go become a plumber, you do your thing. Now, no one ever, and I'd say two things about writing. One, it's solitary. No one's ever going to cheer when you write a story, right? I mean, unless you read it out loud. But it's not like, in high school they shoot a free throw and everyone claps and you're like, I'm the writer, no one cares. But, and maybe that's my ideology, right? But what I'm getting at is there's a lot of writers at Oddball Magazine. A lot of people trying to break into this field. What is some advice you would give to someone who's either trying to write a book? What's some advice you would give to someone who's writing a book? And what's some advice you would give?
I'd like to help with that. I think the number one thing you can do to improve as a writer is to read your own prose out loud and hear how it sounds. Because good writing has kind of a flow to it. It has a conversational feel to it. And especially people trained in like higher education, a lot of times they're not trained to write very well. We're trained to write in a very dense, defensive style that turns most people off, and it turns me off, frankly.
I mean, if your stuff is found in a journal, good luck.
I wrote for journals for a lot of years, and I had to unlearn all those habits to write.
But yeah, go on.
Yeah. So one of the best teachers I ever had basically asked me would tell me to write a paper and then read it out loud onto a tape recorder and then listen to the way it sounded. And I would start hearing all the ways in which it wasn't saying things what I wanted it to say, or wasn't saying it as beautifully as I wanted to say, or wasn't saying it in a way that was easy to follow. When you can hear your own prose that way, you develop a different way of looking at it, and you start to see ways in which, and then it takes a lot of persistence. It's a lot of trial and error. Also, don't get discouraged when that first crappy draft comes out. Just recognize that almost every decent book started off as a crappy draft. So just be patient and wear away the rough edges little by little.
Now, I've interviewed people who have different types of writing styles and different writing methods. So, what is your process? Do you write in the daytime? Do you write after a cup of coffee? Some people, I know someone who wrote at night after meditating. So, like, what is your concept?
That wouldn't work for me. All my clear thinking happens before noon. After that, it's all downhill for me.
So you drink Dunkin' and then you write.
Cup of coffee or two in the morning, and but I like to write from like 6 o'clock until noon, and then break for breakfast.
That's great. I want to thank you for coming on the show. It was a real pleasure to have you. Thanks for entertaining my questions. I gotta ask, how was it meeting Joe Rogan? Was he a cool guy? I mean, was he nice?
Well, he's right up there with you, Jason. I mean, you guys are both great.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
No, I really enjoyed meeting Joe, and he's a good conversationalist and really interesting guy.
Cool guy. So, all right. So, if you want to, and last question, what are you reading right now?
Right now, I am reading a novel that my best friend wrote. One of my best friends wrote. It's called The Art of Good and Evil. It's about a philosophy professor gone bad.
What? Really? Is it available, or are you reading like a draft?
It's just out. Yeah, you can find it on Amazon
I'll have to check it out.
This guy's done some marvelous work on science denial and how the scientific method works. And now he's trying his hand at fiction, and it's always thought-provoking stuff. So his name is Lee McIntyre, and I commend his work to all your listeners.
That's awesome. Well, it was a pleasure having you on the show, Andy. Thank you so much. I hope to run into you sometime and talk more about mental immunity. For the listeners, you can get, actually, we've been on Facebook Live this whole time. I don't know. I don't think anyone actually watches me, but the book is Mental Immunity. It is Andy Norman, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. This book will blow the doors off of your mind. It's very good. So, Andy, I want to thank you for being on the show, and we'll talk soon. Yeah.
Okay.
Best wishes in 2022.
And you. And good luck with all your work for the Oddball Foundation.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Hi, this is Sophia from Oddball Magazine. I just wanted to say thanks for watching The Oddball Show with Jason Wright. Like and subscribe down below if you like what you see. And consider donating to the Oddball Foundation so we can produce more content that you'll love. Thanks for watching.